Hi, everyone. I'm David Lepton from The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030. Welcome to our first in a series of weekly podcasts. This episode is called Facts Are Stubborn Things. I am a boomer, husband, father, and grandfather who is very concerned and more than a little worried that my generation has broken the social contract between ourselves, the past, and future generations. Since this is our first episode of The Reckoning, I thought I would give you folks a brief overview of this and future podcasts. I realize from my retirement perch that you younger people are very busy and hard pressed for time. I will make these weekly podcasts between 10 and 12 minutes, well, maybe another minute or two, and we'll do them once a week. They will be pragmatic, hard-hitting, straight to the point, and filled with probing questions for you to think about. In fact, for all of us to think about. First, for a bit of history. The title of this episode is taken from a statement by John Adams, made in 18th century Boston. I'm starting with this quote because not only is it universally true and applicable to our times, his statement is at the very core of the way we Americans have guided our political actions since the founding of the United States. I am talking about pragmatic thinking. To think pragmatically is to make decisions based on hard, verifiable data and apply insights from that information to the situations that surround us. So I think to myself, okay, here's what I want. Can I get it? And most important of all, will others accept the solutions that I think make the most sense? The Compromise of 1790 is a notable example of American pragmatic thinking. This historical compromise is a precedent for American political history, and it was made between Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison to break a deadlock in Congress. Hamilton and the Northern commercial interests wanted the new national government to assume and pay all state debts incurred since 1776. He and his associates believed that taking the debt all together and combining it would make American credit abroad more viable, and he was right. Jefferson and Madison didn't care about all that, but what they wanted was the new national capital on the Virginia-Maryland border, and not in either New York or Philadelphia, as the North wanted. The North got its national bank, and the South got the national capital on the Potomac River closer to the South. Let's come to grips with these ever-present facts or stubborn things, as John Adams would have it, as they apply in our day. First, economic and financial facts. Secondly, the persistent and political divide between Republicans and Democrats, and the geographical position of the United States in the world. First, we will focus on the economic and financial facts because they are the main drivers influencing our current situation. Let's consider two sets of numbers. U.S. debt in 1970 was $371 billion. In 2023, it rose to $31.4 trillion. That's with a T. That's an increase of 84 times. U.S. GDP in 1970 was $1.07 billion, and it rose in 2023 to $27.3 trillion. That's a T as well. And that's an increase of 25 times. Now think about that for a moment. U.S. debt went up 84 times, and GDP went up 25 times over the last half century. By dividing the debt increase by the GDP growth over the same period, we arrive at a ratio of 3.36. What does this mean for us and your future? Well, it means that for every dollar of increased value to our national economy that we created and consumed for ourselves, $3.36 of national debt was laid on the backs of future generations of Americans. Look to your favorite search engine or your preferred GPT guru, and you will get a quick education on the financial tidal wave that will hit us all. To paraphrase a well-known political quote of the 1990s, I think it was Bill Clinton who made it, you may not be interested in the national debt, but it is very much interested in you and your children. Before continuing our pursuit of stubborn facts, I would like to acknowledge the influence of Robert Gordon's magisterial history of the rise and fall of American growth on my approach to understanding the hard economic reality permeating our history for the last 150 years. Here is the overview of the last century and a half. Please look closely at the graphs that you will see on the screen from Gordon's work showing the ups and downs of our productivity. The first graph covers the years 1870 to 2014. The second graph, the years 1953 to 2013. Notice the ups and downs of the first graph, but also notice the relentless decline in the second graph. Those megatrends are the ones confronting us all. Now let's turn our focus to two other economic indicators: total factor productivity and growth rates of real incomes in the United States. I know, I get it. Total factor productivity, referred to as TFP, sounds ominous and stomach-wrenching. Well, it's really quite simple. TFP is an economic and statistical measure that quantifies productive efficiency based on measurable levels of economic output by labor and capital inputs. If you really want to get more involved in this subject and go look into it in greater detail, surf your favorite website and make your day. Here are some TFP data for you to consider. And while doing so, keep an image in your mind of the upside down U. By the way, I am really thinking in statistical terms of a normal distribution curve. On the left side of the curve, before it goes up, write down the years 1870 to 1920, and then the number 1.5%. At the top of the curve, write down the years 1920 to 1970, and the number 2.5%. On the downward slide to the right of the curve, write down the years 1970 to 2014 and 1.52%. And finally, for the years 1987 to 2022, write down the number 0.7%. Now take a moment to visualize that normal curve with its rising and topping out and declining levels of productivity, and think of the year of your birth. And the rest, they say, is history. Let's turn to the second set of numbers: growth rates of average real income from 1917 to 2023. I would ask you to take a guess at what those numbers would look like. Would they trace the same rising, topping out, and downward slide pattern of total factor productivity? Would they be different? What would those numbers be? I will pause for a few seconds to let you think about it. Time is up. If you guessed that they followed the same rise and fall pattern, then you would win the prize. Relax. Well, maybe not. Here are the answers. From 1917 to 1948, a 1.1 increase in real income. 1948 to 1972, a 2.58% increase in all income. 1972 to 2013, a 0.48% increase. And from 2013 to 2023, no increase whatsoever. Should we be surprised at this result? Well, not at all. In fact, we can feel it in our bones. These are the stubborn facts that will not go away. All the huffing and puffing of public figures at all levels of government cannot change the hard truths of declining productivity, declining real incomes, and skyrocketing debt. It is not that these well-intentioned public officials do not want to help us. Of course they do. But they cannot. It's our collective economic performance over time. It is really shocking. What would be your solution to our economic malaise? I'll leave that question with you. And please do think hard on it. The second stubborn fact is the stable American political divide since the 1950s. Americans and Democrats generally garner 40% of the total vote as their respective base amounts with the other 20% dividing mostly, but not always equally, between the two parties. Naturally, there are occasional large swing elections, sometimes called landslide elections, in either of the congressional houses or the presidential vote. For the most part, third parties make little lasting impact on voters. The third stubborn thing is our nation's geographical place in the Western Hemisphere. Here's a thumbnail sketch of our geopolitical interests. We are a continental island with a maritime empire spreading into the Eastern Hemisphere across both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. President Jefferson started the imperial vision in the early 19th century by calling the U.S. the Empire of Liberty. At the time, he was looking westwards across the continent.
He tended to think in very large terms. In fact, in 1803, he doubled the size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase, which expanded U.S. borders from the Mississippi River westwards to the Rocky Mountains. That was an enormous increase.
The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in the late 19th century were our geographical shock absorbers, insulating us from the turmoil often racking the Eastern Hemisphere. Unfortunately, that turmoil endures to this day. Just look at the Ukraine, the perpetual fighting in the Middle East, and the instability in sub-Saharan Africa. We may have crossed the oceans looking for trouble, but after the War of 1812 and until World War I, that's in 1914, trouble never came to our shores from the Eastern Hemisphere. Well, World War II changed all that. It is precisely the instability and violence so characteristic of that hemisphere that drove immigrants to the United States and in fact continues to enrich our country. I know this personally, since my grandparents were among those immigrants. Let's not forget that we are a nation of immigrants.
The only difference is the date of entry of our ancestors and our present-day arrivals, but we're all Americans in any event.
Now for the good news. We are a long way away from most places in the world, except, of course, Canada and Mexico. The bad news is that we are a long way away from our allies abroad. The critical issue to think about is the great expense involved in projecting our influence abroad. I leave it to my listeners to speculate on how our growing national debt and declining productivity would impact our foreign policy. That discussion, too, will be left for a future episode. Well, this concludes the three stubborn, ever-present facts and trends that we will all have to deal with now and in the future. Kindly keep in mind these stubborn things in our future episodes, as we will often refer to them. That's it for now, and my apologies for a slightly longer podcast, but I did want to get all that key data to you from the get-go. You will hear from me, David Lipton, in about a week's time. You can access my ideas and thoughts by visiting Amazon.com and search for The Reckoning, July 4th, 2030.